Okay, everybody, for this class, we're going to talk about Congress and what's called the legislative elite. So, a lot of these members of Congress will have political entrepreneurship, meaning that, these people are generally from well educated, prestigiously employed, either, maybe a lot of them are from law firms, affluent, upper, and upper middle class. A lot of these politicians are going to be career politicians, meaning that's the only job they know. And political parties usually do not recruit candidates anymore. Candidates kind of recruit themselves, and that's a very interesting thing to look at. As being a member of Congress is very attractive. Lawyers primarily dominate Congress because they know how to work within the laws, and they may also know how to circumvent the laws. And generally, these people are going to be a lot more educated. And like I said, they're going to be going to top schools. A lot of senators are former lawyers that have also clerked for Supreme Court justices. So, in a sense, they are from the upper class systems of our country here. Generally, European American males have historically dominated Congress, but we have seen women and minorities have made substantial gains since the 1920s. So currently, we have about 58 members of the House of Representatives that are African American. We have 3 in the Senate. Latinx has 44 members in the House, 7 in the Senate. There's 16 Asian Americans in the House, 2 in the Senate. In 2022, and this is prior to the midterm elections, we have 148 women in the House and the Senate. We've also seen a gain in Native Americans. This includes Native Hawaiians as well. We have 5 Native Americans serving in the House. And one thing to look at and one thing to maybe question is that the mean age of Congress is 57 years old. If we look at party numbers, and remember, this is prior to the 2022 midterm elections, currently the House of Representatives has 218 Democrats, plus 4 delegates. These delegates cannot vote, but these are people like perhaps from the Virgin Islands, the Marianas Islands, Guam, Puerto Rico, America, Samoa, and they have representation in Congress. And consequently, people that live in those areas, in those territories, are American citizens, but they can't vote in elections that are on that are not within one of the 50 states. If they would migrate and establish residency in a state, then they would be able to vote. And currently, there are 5 vacant seats, either by death or by resignation. The Senate is currently at a 50-50 split. 50 Republicans, 48 Democrats, with 2 independents who caucus with the Democrats. So traditionally, prior to 1994, the Democrats controlled the House of Representatives. 1994 was kind of an interesting year where we saw the transition of power go from the Democrats to the Republicans, and they had something called the Contract for America, which really focused on an America First policy. And we saw that kind of as a response to the Clinton administration. But one thing that you can see is that party control of the House and the Senate has switched back and forth almost every, I want to say every election in the 21st century, like the author says, but I would say at pretty much at every midpoint of a presidential administration, you could see some switch over. And we have a very divided government. I mean, we have perhaps the largest amount of polarization in the United States that we have ever had. And polarization is kind of the gap in thought between the left and the right. And I think it really started I really noticed it in 1994. Some of you are going to be a little bit too young to remember that, but I think that's when I first really noticed the polarization in government. And it really intensified up during the Clinton administration, especially during his Lewinsky scandal, and then all the way up into the kind of the electorate that we have now, where there's virtually no compromise between the two parties, and then we can see legislation get stalled because of that. The personal wealth of members of Congress is well above that of the average citizen. And then if you go into that Open Secrets website, there's going to also be an Open Secrets lecture that I'll splice into this video, and it'll show the wealthiest member of Congress as well as the poorest member of Congress. But I think one of the more interesting things is net worth gain once somebody gets into Congress. I think we saw on the Open Secrets website that the one person's net worth went up like 11,000% from when they were a private citizen to when they joined Congress until now. And here is a link where you can look at that. So a lot of people don't know who their senator is. Even less people know who their representatives, and even less people can name both. All right, so we can kind of surmise what their public policy positions would be and try to figure out how they would vote and who we prefer to have represent us, because they have to match our values. But as we've kind of seen throughout history, is that members of Congress have really stopped kind of advocating for our interests, but have really advocated more for special interest. And kind of throughout, different parts of the country, different sectors of the country, different areas of the country has specific industries that are attached to it. Like in New England, you have lumbering, fishing, insurances, agricultural, like maybe up and down the middle of the country, you have agricultural producers, American Farm Bureau Federation. In the Southwest, oil producers and ranchers. In the mountain states, we have tourism and mining. And I think if we look in California, what industry that we do not have, we don't have coal here, but we pretty much have every industry here in the United States in California, whether it's mining, which is a small thing by now, absolutely tourism, tech, pharmaceuticals, and all of these are very prevalent here in California. There's also certain things that come out of who does Congress really represent. So, they really try to focus on home style, so to get votes for themselves in certain areas. I mean, imagine if you were a representative here in the United States and you represented, say, Oceanside, and Oceanside lost Camp Pendleton. The Department of Defense decided to move everybody out of Camp Pendleton and abandon the base. That would have a devastating effect on the economy, right? So it would look bad on you, right? So you can kind of also look at the inverse way. Say that they wanted to expand the size of Camp Pendleton, and you really advocated for that because more people would bring in more revenue, such as taxation, rent money, and all that. So you kind of focus on what your area is and try to improve that area by getting projects started in that area. Sometimes there might be casework involved. So you have a member of Congress that can help constituents as individuals. My parents had some problem with their Social Security a couple of years ago, and they called their House Representative member, and they were able to help them. So that's an example of casework. Sometimes you have pork, and that's the appropriation of government monies for localized projects secured solely or primarily to bring money to a representative's district. So you say you're representing Oceanside, right? And you hear that the government wants to expand a military base here in the United States, and you go, well, Oceanside would be a good example. So let's go ahead and do it here. Here are A, B, and C why I think it should happen. That would be an example of pork, right? You're doing something that is going to specifically benefit your district. Earmarks, these are specific funds that are allocated for specific projects or specific programs. Head Start is a good example of an earmark. So this money is specifically set aside for that program. And then you have fundraising. So some people believe that we should have term limits, and in the book, it argues about term limits. Kind of with the form of democracy that we have here, this representative democracy, it's kind of implied that if we don't like our representatives, we can vote them out. Yet, incumbents are overwhelmingly elected. So, House members will win about 90% of the time, senators will win about 75% of the time. These incumbents usually are looked on favorably by their own electorate, because most voters will approve of their own representative but disapprove of Congress as a whole. And it might be in relation to, maybe some of them being able to accomplish things through what we have here on this list. Also, incumbents have advantages like name familiarity. They have resources of their office that includes things like franking, which allows members of Congress and their staff to send mail to their constituents or supporters without having to pay postage. And when you think about that, I mean, even if you look at some type of bulk rate through the post office, if you don't have these franking privileges, you're going to have to pay some money to send out mailers. These people who are incumbents have that advantage that the Congressional Post Office will send it. They have heavy earmarking privileges, like we talked about. And remember, interest groups and PACs are going to bet on a winner. So they bet on the incumbents because, remember, the incumbents are going to win about 90% of the time. So should we have term limits? If we look at kind of both sides of this, proponents usually rely on anti-elite arguments that, you can replace that career politician with somebody fresh. Term limits would increase competition and encourage more people to seek office. Opponents will say that, term limits would infringe on freedom of choice, and if you're unhappy with your senator or representative, you can vote them out. It also reduces the overall level of experience for lawmakers. And, one thing that you also have to kind of take a look at is that committee assignments, and we'll talk about committees in a little bit. Committee assignments are given out based off of seniority. So the more seniority that you have in Congress, the more likely you are to be put on one of these more prestigious committees. So let's go ahead. Here is a list or the written out form of how a bill becomes a law. Take a look at these. We have these committees, and then I'm going to show you in a little bit more detail on a handout that we have. But here's the written out part, and here's the part where I talk about the seniority system and how committee and subcommittee chairpersons are decided by seniority, and as their influence grows, they tend to be put on more prestigious committees, which may help your home district. So when we look at the committees, one of the more powerful things is being the chairperson of the committees. They're the ones that determine the bills that the committees will consider, select issues for public hearings, and establishes the agenda. So in a sense, they kind of act as a gatekeeper for bills. And this is a very, very important power to have, because they can let bills in, but they can also keep bills out. The Rules Committee is one of the most powerful committees in Congress. Their responsibility is to review most bills as they come from a full committee before they go to a full chamber of for consideration. They can set the date for the debate. They can set the time slotted for discussion, and they can also often make amendments. And also, they can kind of capture a bill and shelve it, and then the bill will die. We'll watch a video here about a filibuster. This is something that's been in the news lately, where the Democrats want to eliminate the filibuster. The Senate Rules Committee puts a length of time on debate for a bill. If debate is not done or completed by the end of that time, then the bill dies. So each senator has the power to slow or block a bill's passage by talking the bill to death. You keep talking and talking and talking and talking. Debate can be limited by cloture vote, but you need 60 votes to invoke cloture, meaning you need 60 votes to stop debate. If you don't have those 60 votes, then you can keep discussing the bill until the time runs out, and then the bill will die. If it's a presidential nominee, to invoke cloture is 51 votes for the Senate. Meaning if there's a presidential nominee, whether it's a member of the cabinet or a Supreme Court justice, you need only a 51 count to close debate. And then you also have a floor vote in both chambers. The floor vote is where you have an approval by the committee. It moves to the floor for a vote. This is going to be where the most of your amendments take place. It's going to be during the floor vote and debate. Currently, the Democrats are trying to do away with the filibuster. It's a Senate rule, and it's not mentioned in the Constitution. So it can be changed. So you would just need a 60 vote in order to be able to stop a filibuster, to abolish a filibuster, so to speak. So we'll get more into this. There's conference committee.
On March 6, 2013, Senator Rand Paul began a filibuster of the appointment of John Brennan as head of the CIA. He did this to try to force a clear statement from the White House that it was unconstitutional to use drones to kill Americans in the United States just because they're suspected of terrorism. His argument is that it's a clear violation of the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, which guarantees due process.
This is not about partisanship. I have allowed the president to pick his political appointees, but I will not sit quietly and let him shred the Constitution. I cannot sit at my desk quietly and let the president say that he will kill Americans on American soil who are not actively attacking a country.
Paul continued for 12 hours and 52 minutes with help from several other senators, making headlines across the nation. Soon after Paul finished, Attorney General Eric Holder sent a letter saying the White House would not use drones to kill Americans not engaged in combat. Senator Paul's nearly 13-hour speech is impressive, but there have been other occasions when senators have spoken even longer on the issues that they have seen as extremely important. The term filibuster comes from the Dutch word vrijbuiter, meaning pirate or robber, which word is also the root of freebooter. It was used to refer to William Walker, who led a group of Americans to Nicaragua in 1855 to aid in a revolt to overthrow the government. For a time, he was successful and was able to take leadership of the nation. But his regime was ended when he was attacked by the surrounding nations. The term in its legislative sense was first used by Congressman Albert Brown of Mississippi in 1853, referring to Abraham Watkins Venable's speech against filibustering intervention in Cuba. Although the term has only been used since the 19th century, the practice was used much earlier. In the time of the Romans, it was used most famously by Cato the Younger in his opposition to Julius Caesar. The rules in the Roman Senate were that all proceedings had to be ended before nightfall, so Cato simply talked until sunset, and the bill could not pass that day. Filibusters do take place in the British Parliament, but they're not nearly as long-winded. The record speech in the House of Commons is 6 hours, set by Henry Brougham in 1828. However, this was not even intended as a filibuster. Filibusters were used most commonly against the Irish Coercion Acts by those who were trying to get independence for Ireland. They were able to delay the passage of the bills for years. The 21st century record was set in 2005 by Andrew Dismore, who spoke for 3 hours and 17 minutes. There are two types of filibusters in the U.S. Senate today. The most common one is called a silent filibuster. At the beginning of the nation, both the House and the Senate allowed the debate to be ended by a previous question motion, which could be passed by a simple majority. It seems as though that this was not normally used to stifle debate. In the Senate, this rule was dropped in 1806 when Aaron Burr, the Vice President of the United States, said it was redundant. This accidentally opened the door for senators to continue to talk as long as they could to delay a bill from passing. In 1917, Senate Rule 22 was added, allowing debates to be limited when a closure motion is passed with a 3/5 majority. This means that as long as 40% of the senators do not want a bill to come to the floor, they can block it by continuing to speak and refusing to vote for a closure motion. Today it's called a silent filibuster, because the senators do not even have to go to the floor to speak. Because if 40% of them threaten a filibuster, the Senate moves on to other business, knowing that they'll never be able to finish the debate. This requirement causes important votes to need 3/5 of the senators to desire the vote to take place, which often means that the legislation itself needs 3/5 of the votes to pass rather than just a majority, because they can't close the debate. Use of this type of filibuster has increased in recent years, and the record number of closure votes was in 2008. In fact, while Rand Paul was speaking on the Senate floor, Republicans were participating in a silent filibuster of the appointment of Caitlin Halligan to the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia, a filibuster that's been going on and off since 2010. Appointees to that court frequently are filibustered because it's seen as a stepping stone to the Supreme Court. 4 of the current Supreme Court justices previously served on that court, and it's had vacancies since 2005. Rand Paul's filibuster was of the second kind, called a talking filibuster. If 40% of the senators will not join in refusing to close debate, one member can continue speaking as long as he can, refusing to yield the floor to allow the bill to proceed. But the rules don't make it easy for them. They can't take any breaks from speaking, and can't even sit down. They can take questions without yielding the floor, allowing their fellow senators to give them a break with very long-winded questions. The senator conducting the filibuster is still not allowed to leave the room. These rules have led to some very dramatic events through the history of the Senate. In the 1930s, Louisiana Democrat Huey Long filibustered several bills. In arguing against a bill he believed was unfair to the poor, he recited recipes for salad dressing and discussed at length the best way to fry oysters. His most famous filibuster was on June 12, 1935. Used against a bill that would give jobs under the National Recovery Act to his political opponents. He was able to speak without stop for 15 hours and 30 minutes. Running out of things to say about the bill, he offered to give advice on any subject someone requested. No other senators would give him anything to talk about, but people in the galleries sent down notes giving him more topics to speak on. In 1953, independent Wayne Morse of Oregon set a new record by filibustering for 22 hours and 26 minutes against the Tidelands oil legislation. Senator Strom Thurmond broke this record 3 years later by filibustering the Civil Rights Act of 1957 for 24 hours and 18 minutes, a record which remains unbroken to this day. Thurmond was from South Carolina. The bill he was opposing was designed to prevent discrimination against black voters in the South by prohibiting intimidating anyone on any voting issue. The Southern Democrats had agreed not to filibuster the bill, but Thurmond decided to do it on his own. He came prepared, bringing food, water, and lozenges with him. He also spent time in a sauna, dehydrating himself so he wouldn't have to use the bathroom. Most filibusters end around the 12th hour because of the need to use the restroom. His 24-hour speech included reading aloud the voting laws of each U.S. state, George Washington's farewell address, the Declaration of Independence, and the Bill of Rights. Cots were brought in from a hotel so that the other senators could sleep without leaving the chamber. He was given a break about 4 hours in by Barry Goldwater. Goldwater asked him how long he could continue without using the restroom, and Thurmond said only about another hour. Goldwater gave him the opportunity to slip out by moving for something to be read to the congressional record, without Thurmond yielding the floor. Technically, by leaving the room, he would have lost the floor, but the technicality was ignored, as it also was when he sat down for a time and left the room to quickly eat a sandwich in the cloakroom. In the middle of his speech, he allowed the majority leader, Lyndon B. Johnson, to conduct minor Senate business, including swearing in a new senator, all while Thurmond still technically held the floor. Thurmond drew laughs at the end of his speech when he said, "Mr. President, I urge every member of this body to consider this bill most carefully. I hope the Senate will see fit to kill it. I expect to vote against the bill. This bill would eventually pass, and Thurman was just at the beginning of a long career in the Senate. He would serve for 48 years, and when he left the Senate in 2003, he was the longest-serving senator in the body's history, and the only one to serve past 100 years of age. The House of Representatives no longer has the filibuster. They did until 1842, when debate was limited as the number of members was growing. The minority then switched to the disappearing quorum tactic, where they would refuse to answer the roll call, forcing the House to adjourn as they had less than a quorum. The practice was ended on January 29, 1890, by Speaker of the House Thomas Brackett Reed. 163 Democrats had refused to vote on a bill to decide a contested West Virginia election. But in doing the roll call, Reed directed the clerk to record all those in the chamber, even if they didn't answer. The House immediately erupted in an uproar. The Democrats rushed for the doors to escape the room, but found them locked. They all shouted for recognition, calling Reed a czar and a tyrant. They tried to hide under their desks so that they couldn't be seen, but all to no avail. After several more days of wrangling, the bill was passed, and the rules were amended to outlaw the disappearing quorum. Constitutionally, it makes sense for the Senate to have the filibuster, but not the House. In the original Constitution, the Senate represented the states and the House the people. The Senate was intended to be a more mature and deliberative body, which is why the members' terms were 6 years rather than 2 as in the House, and they had to be 30 years of age rather than just 25. They also had longer citizenship requirements. The most famous filibuster didn't even occur in the Senate. It was in the 1939 film, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Junior Senator Jefferson Smith, played by Jimmy Stewart, talks for 24 hours against the corruption in the Senate, which was about to get him expelled.
Well, I guess the gentlemen are in a pretty tall hurry to get me out of here. The way the evidence is piled up against me, I can't say I blame them much. And I'm quite willing to go, sir, when they vote it that way. But before that happens, I've got a few things I want to say to this body. I tried to say them once before, and I got stopped colder than a mackerel. Well, I'd like to get them said this time, sir. And as a matter of fact, I'm not going to leave this body until I do get them said. In other words, I've got a piece to speak. And blow hot or cold, I'm going to speak it.
Half of official Washington is here to see democracy's finest show, the filibuster. The right to talk your head off. The American privilege of free speech in its most dramatic form. The least man in that chamber, once he gets and holds that floor by the rules, can hold it and talk as long as he can stand on his feet.
Some see the talking filibuster as a waste, as a useless obstruction of the Senate to prevent it from getting real work done. But this is far from true. The filibuster is important because it gives the opportunity for one man to make his case heard. The ultimate goal in a filibuster is not to prevent the bill from passing. A dozen hours one way or the other normally will not make that much of a difference. The purpose of a filibuster is for one senator to bring his argument before his colleagues and the nation by making a dramatic stand and saying this issue is so important that he's willing to stand on the floor of the Senate for hours to make sure his argument is heard.
If a bill passes both houses of Congress, they have to be identical before it goes to the president. If the Senate amends a House bill, the House will need to amend their bill. And if there cannot be a consensus on the changes, then usually you have a conference committee where you have people from both chambers meet and try to work out their differences. So a good example is kind of the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021, or one of the stimulus packages that we had. So when it was introduced, the first step was the House Budget Committee. It passed 19-16. Then it was set up as a reconciliation bill to help pass the Senate. Not all Democrats were on board because they wanted to increase the minimum wage to $15 an hour. It was passed on February 26, 2021 by a 219 to 212 vote. Then it was passed to the Senate. So it moved to the Senate, right? Lawmakers made several changes through the legislation, but 3 were really, really important. They narrowed the eligibility for the stimulus check. They trimmed the federal boost to unemployment benefits, and they nixed the idea of the $15 an hour minimum wage. It was passed along party lines by a 50 to 49 vote. Senator Sullivan out of Alaska was absent due to a family emergency. I believe he had a family member pass away, so something that's really understandable. But anyways, if it was a 50-50 split, Vice President Harris would have broke the tie. But since these bills were changed, you can see that it had to go back to the House. Since the Senate changed parts of the bills by eliminating that $15 an hour minimum wage, it went back to the House. The House voted 220 to 211 to pass the measure. One Democrat voted no, and it was passed on 3/10/21, and then President Biden signed it on 3/11/21. So when people are kind of looking at Congress, they usually think that the Senate is going to be more prestigious, and that's true. Senators will have more formal powers than House of Representative members. Remember, they have the power of the filibuster, which is important. They can advise and consent on executive appointments. So if the president makes a selection for a new Secretary of State, it has to go through the Senate. They have 6-year terms. They represent a broad, heterogeneous constituency, and they have the concept of senatorial courtesy. Generally, what senatorial courtesy will mean is, say, for instance, you are a sitting member of Congress or a sitting senator, and the president wants you to be their Secretary of State. Generally, senatorial courtesy will involve all senators voting for that person to be Secretary of State. But we've kind of seen actions that have gone away from that lately. If you want a specific example, look at the movement to get Jeff Sessions appointed Attorney General. He was met with a lot of resistance from the Democrats when Trump appointed him to be Attorney General. And, it was a concern about past comments he's made about race. So there was a lack of senatorial courtesy there. Here's the leadership in Congress. We'll go ahead and click on this. And we can see Speaker of the House, which is the most powerful position in Congress, is Nancy Pelosi. She is third in line to be the president. So if something happened to Biden, something happened to Harris, she would be president. And then you can see Democratic leadership here. We have Steny Hoyer on the left. The whip, the majority whip, is the person that will try to get the groups together to try to get the Democrats together in this case and adhere to party discipline. So they go out and say, okay, we need your vote on this. You need to do this, that. And that's the whip. I don't know if any of you have seen House of Cards, but the Kevin Spacey, Jack Underwood, I believe the character's name was, he was the Democratic whip, making sure that people followed that party discipline. If you look on the other side, we have Kevin McCarthy. He's the minority leader. So he represents the Republicans on the House floor. And if the Republicans would get the majority at the midterm point, then he has been kind of seeking to be leader. So you can see that's the Democratic leadership and the Republican leadership in the House. So let's go back and let's look at this. This is leadership in the Senate. So the president of the Senate is Kamala Harris. She will break any tie. And then if Vice President Harris isn't there, then President Pro Temp Patrick Leahy is in charge. He's the president of the Senate if Vice President Harris isn't there. And if you look at him, you may recognize him. He actually stars or makes guest appearances in Batman movies. I don't think he was in the Robert Pattinson Batman because I think he's had some health issues or something like that. But he had been in every other Batman movie because he's a big fan of the comics. And if you look at this here, the Democratic leaderships, we have the majority leader, which is Charles Schumer. And then we have the whip, who is Dick Durbin. And then if we look at the Republican leadership, the minority leader is Mitch McConnell, and John Thune is the Republican whip. And remember, the whip is the ones that try to get people to adhere to party discipline. So we talk about the Speaker of the House already. They're elected by the majority of the House. Majority party of the House, they share committee appointments, so they can put certain House of Representative members on committees. They can rule on matters of House procedure. They refer bills to committees and appoint conferences, committees, and they're third in line for the presidency. And we talked a little bit about floor leaders and whips. The vice president of the U.S. is the president of the Senate. They only basically vote to break ties. And the president pro temp is elected by the majority party, and they preside in the absence of the vice president. And we talked about the majority leaders and the minority leaders. You also have committee chairs. If you look back on that list, you could see the committee chairs. And then you also have leadership PACs who are responsible for giving members PAC money to support Congress. We have a lot of polarization on Capitol Hill, and this is, Republicans are generally more oppose government growth and spending than ever, and Democrats are more committed to federal government expansion than in previous years. And this has all kind of been dated back to the 80s, where we started to see a realignment of Southern voters from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party in the 80s. So we can almost guarantee how people are going to vote, and they usually vote based on party lines. In general, there's going to be conflicts over things like taxation, welfare programs, healthcare, the environment, things that might be attached to values that we have, regulating business and labor, and the size and role of government. And that has created a lot of polarization on Capitol Hill. Now, one of the most important powers that Congress has is the power of impeachment. This is the ultimate congressional power, and our Constitution states that you can be impeached for committing treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. So if you look at this, you can see that last part is a very, very broad topic. Now, generally, all of these impeachment movements in U.S. history have been developed on political grounds. We know we've had 3 presidents impeached in history. One president was impeached twice, but neither of the 3 have been removed. So there's another step. So what will happen is the House of Representatives will issue articles of impeachment, and then that will move to the Senate. And then the Senate will hold like a trial. The Justice of the Supreme Court is the main judge and acts as the arbitrator. In order to remove a president, you need 66 votes. Strike the 60 votes, and remember, 66 votes are needed to remove a president. And we'll talk a little bit more when we get to the presidency, especially in the Clinton presidency, and look how he was impeached, but he wasn't really close to being removed. Neither was Trump. And you could probably make the argument that the second Trump impeachment was for inciting that mob that took over the Capitol on January 6th, which, might not totally be based on political ground, but more on legal. But you could argue the first one, and then Clinton's, and then Andrew Johnson's were based on political grounds. But that's more of a, personal view on what issues were involved with that. So Congress has also stuff to do with foreign policy. And the foreign policy of power of Congresses are to approve treaties, treaties with other countries, to declare war, to create a military and maintain a military, to make rules governing land and naval forces, to regulate foreign commerce, to declare war, and they are shared with the president by generally letting the president take the lead. And, kind of by granting the Senate the sole power to offer advice and consent on nomination and treaties, the Constitution gives senators a major role in developing foreign policy. The president will nominate diplomats and negotiate treaties, but the Senate determines that those nominees will serve, or if those treaties will be ratified by 2/3 of a vote. So here's a list of committees. Go ahead and take a look at that. Now we look at California. California has its own legislature as well. And members of the assemblies are elected from 80 districts and serve 2-year terms. Members of the California Senate are elected from 40 districts and serve 4-year terms. This is the California legislature. So we have the Assembly and the Senate. And bills are virtually passed the same. Now, we also have kind of a commission, an independent commission that draws lines here. Here in California, we're going to be losing a congressional seat due to the census that happened in 2020. So there is a committee made up of an independent commission that draws the lines, and they are supposed to draw them as fairly as possible, or as nearly as is practical, which is the legal word used. So the state must make a good faith effort to draw districts with exactly the same number of people in each district within the state. Any district with more or fewer people than the average must be specifically justified by consistent state policy. So a lot of things that are put into place to avoid that concept of gerrymandering that we all kind of heard about throughout history. And state and local legislative districts have a bit more flexibility. They have to be substantially equal. And over a series of cases, it's become accepted that a plan will be constitutionally suspect if there's the largest and smallest districts are more than 10% apart. So there's definitely work that's done, and there's a lot of eyes on this process. And this could lead to gerrymandering, like I mentioned. This is the manipulation of borders to favor one class or one party or one ethnicity. It comes from Governor Jerry in Massachusetts submitting a district that was benefiting his Democratic Republican Party. And when mapped, it looked like a salamander. And there's examples of worse gerrymandering districts here in the United States. Okay, so if you have any questions, definitely let me know, and we will talk soon. Okay, everybody, here's the handout of the legislative process. So remember, a bill can start either in the House or the Senate. One caveat to that: if it is a revenue bill, a bill that generates revenue, it has to start in the House per the Constitution. But any other idea can start either in the House and the Senate. So a bill's introduced by a member, and then it goes to a committee that handles it. The committee is made up of anywhere from 15 to 20 people, and there has to be a majority vote to pass the bill on to the full House for a floor vote. Once it is passed, then it is argued and discussed, and there's amendments made. And then if it's passed, it goes to go through the Senate, and the Senate does the same thing, but they have to pass the same exact version of the bill, right? So the bill that passes the House has to pass the Senate, the same version. Now, if the Senate changes it, your whole process starts again if you can't come to a consensus in a joint meeting. So just remember that the first step is that a member of Congress introduces the bill. It goes to the committee that handles that bill. If the committee on that bill decides to pass it, then it goes down to the floor vote. If they decline to pass it, then the bill dies. The floor vote decides. If the floor vote comes as a majority, the bill passes. If it's not a majority, the bill dies. You go up, it has to be in the Senate. The Senate will introduce it, go to a committee. If the committee gives a thumbs down, the bill dies. If they give a thumbs up, it goes to the next part, which is the floor vote and discussion for the Senate. If it's passed, it goes to the president to sign. If it is not passed, it either dies if a consensus cannot be reached through both parties of Congress and both chambers of Congress. Then it can go to the president. The president can sign it, or the president can veto it. If the president vetoes it, it dies if Congress cannot override that veto with 2/3 vote. So a lot of hiccups, and you can see all the X's on this, and I think these X's are a good example of some of the hindrances that we have in legislation and why legislation gets stalled a lot. So just kind of be mindful of that. And remember also, the bill can start in the Senate unless it's a revenue bill. So a bill can start here, go through the process, and have to go through the process in the House, and then eventually signed by the president. All right, so that's the bill making process.
As your body grows bigger,
Your mind must flower.
it's great to learn.
Cause knowledge is power.
It's Schoolhouse Rockin', a chip off the block of your favorite schoolhouse, schoolhouse rock.
Woo, you sure gotta climb a lot of steps to get to this Capitol building here in Washington. Well, I wonder who that sad little scrap of paper is.
I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. Well, it's a long, long journey to the capital city. It's a long, long wait while I'm sitting in committee, but I know I'll be a law someday. At least I hope and pray that I will, but today I am still just a bill.
Gee, Bill, you certainly have a lot of patience and courage.
Well, I got this far. When I started, I wasn't even a bill. I was just an idea. Some folks back home decided they wanted a law passed, so they called their local congressman, and he said, "You're right, there ought to be a law." Then he sat down and wrote me out and introduced me to Congress, and I became a bill. And I'll remain a bill until they decide to make me a law. I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I got as far as Capitol Hill. Well, now I'm stuck in committee, and I'll sit here and wait while a few key congressmen discuss and debate whether they should let me be a law. I hope and pray that they will, but today I am still just a bill.
Listen to those congressmen arguing. Is all that discussion and debate about you?
Yeah, I'm one of the lucky ones. Most bills never even get this far. I hope they decide to report on me favorably, otherwise I may die.
Die?
Yeah, die in committee. Oh, but it looks like I'm going to live. Now I go to the House of Representatives and they vote on me.
If they vote yes, what happens?
Then I go to the Senate and the whole thing starts all over again.
Oh, no.
Oh, yes. I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. And if they vote for me on Capitol Hill, well, then I'm off to the White House where I'll wait in a line with a lot of other bills for the president to sign. And if he signs me, then I'll be a law. How I hope and pray that he will. But today I am still just a bill.
You mean even if the whole Congress says you should be a law, the president can still say no?
Yes, that's called a veto. If the president vetoes me, I have to go back to Congress and they vote on me again, and by that time you're so
By
old.
that time, it's very unlikely that you become a law. It's not easy to become a law, is it?
No, but how I hope and pray that I will. But today I am still just a bill.
He signed your bill. Now you're a law.
Oh, yes.